The late-night silence of the opulent modern kitchen was a world away from anything Elena Cruz had ever known. She padded across the polished marble floor, the cold seeping through the thin soles of her slippers. Her only goal, a simple glass of water to soothe her frayed nerves. A shadow detached itself from the doorway, so sudden and silent that a gasp caught in her throat. It was him, Damian Moretti. He held a small, framed photograph in his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet was more dangerous than any shout. "I should fire you," he said, the words slicing through the stillness. He held up the photo, turning it so the light caught the image. It was a picture of Elena and her sister, Isabella, their arms slung around each other, their smiles bright and genuine from a time before their world had fractured. "Tell me, Elena, how long were you planning on keeping this a secret?" Elena's blood ran cold, her fingers went numb, and the heavy glass slipped, falling to the floor and shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. The sharp, explosive sound echoed the complete and utter destruction of her carefully constructed deception. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. A week earlier, the world had been a much smaller, more desperate place. Elena's apartment was a cramped testament to her life as a freelance book restorer, a space that smelled of turpentine, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying glue, smells that had once been a comfort, but now only reminded her of her failure. Work, once a steady trickle, had dried to a dust bowl. A formidable pile of bills sat on her small kitchen table, a paper dragon breathing down her neck. The bold red letters of a final notice peeked out from beneath an envelope containing yet another medical expense for her sister. Isabella was still so fragile, a delicate piece of porcelain that Damian Moretti had dropped and shattered years ago. The emotional fallout had been a long, expensive, and arduous road, and the costs kept mounting. The shrill ring of her phone cut through the oppressive quiet. It was a high-end employment agency she'd signed up with in a fit of desperation months ago. The woman on the other end of the line was brisk and professional, her voice oozing an efficiency that felt alien in Elena's chaotic life. A job, a live-in babysitting position. The pay she quoted was astronomical, a figure so far beyond Elena's reality that for a moment she thought it was a prank. It was enough. Enough to slay the paper dragon, to pay for Isabella's care, to finally breathe again. The details were sparse, shrouded in a thick fog of confidentiality. The client was high profile, a man who demanded absolute discretion. No last names were exchanged during the brief, impersonal interview process. The only concrete piece of information was the address, a location nestled in the city's most exclusive, heavily guarded neighborhood. A flicker of hope, hot and bright, ignited in her chest, though it was quickly tempered by a cold wave of apprehension. Who was this man, and why the intense secrecy? Later that day, she called Isabella. Her sister's voice was a pale, listless version of its former self. The vibrant energy leached out of it. "I'm fine, Lena," she murmured, the lie as thin as the worn-out blanket she likely had wrapped around her. Elena's heart ached. She forced a brightness into her own voice, spinning a tale of a new book restoration project, a rare find that would pay well. She reassured her sister that everything would be okay, that she would handle it all. The weight of the lie, and the deeper weight of her responsibility, settled heavily on her shoulders. Hanging up the phone, her decision solidified into something hard and resolute. She would take the mysterious job. She had to. The address didn't lead to a house, it led to a fortress. A sheer cliff face of glass, steel, and dark stone rose from behind imposing walls, its modern architecture both beautiful and brutal. Security cameras, sleek and black like predatory birds, perched at every angle. This wasn't a home, it was a statement of power, a declaration of untouchability. Elena's small, beat-up car felt like a dinghy pulling up to a battleship. The massive front door swung open before she could even ring the bell, revealing a woman in her 60s, dressed in a severe but impeccably tailored gray suit. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun, and her expression was as unyielding as the stone walls. Miss Cruz, I am Mrs. Petrova, the housekeeper. You are expected. Her voice was clipped, with a faint Eastern European accent that added another layer of severity. She led Elena into a cavernous entryway, where her footsteps echoed on the marble floors. The house was a museum of wealth, filled with priceless-looking art and minimalist furniture arranged with geometric precision. It was stunning, but sterile. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no warmth. The air smelled of lemon polish and, faintly, of money itself. Mrs. Petrova laid out the rules with the precision of a drill sergeant. Mr. Moretti values his privacy above all else. Your contract contains a non-disclosure agreement of formidable scope. There will be no social media posts, no photographs, no unapproved visitors. You are here for one reason, and one reason only: the well-being of the child. You will see nothing, and you will say nothing. Is that understood? Elena nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She felt like a specimen being examined under a microscope. Mrs. Petrova led her through a series of vast, silent rooms to a playroom that looked like it had been lifted directly from a high-end design catalog. Every toy was educational, aesthetically pleasing, and arranged in perfect order. And in the center of the room, on a pristine white rug, sat a little girl with enormous, solemn brown eyes and dark silky hair. She couldn't have been more than 5. "This is Serafina," Mrs. Petrova announced, her voice softening by a fraction of a degree. The little girl didn't look up. She was beautiful, a perfect miniature, but her presence was tinged with a profound loneliness that radiated from her small frame. Elena's heart, already bruised and battered by her own worries, went out to her instantly. This was the child she was here for. This was the reason she was stepping into this gilded cage. Later that evening, Elena felt the first flicker of success. She was on the floor of the sterile playroom, a sketchpad open in her lap. After an hour of quiet, patient effort, she had finally coaxed a small, hesitant smile from Serafina by drawing a ridiculously goofy-looking dragon with mismatched wings and a top hat. The smile was a tiny, precious thing, but it was there. It was a start. In that moment, Elena felt a genuine connection, a sense of purpose that went beyond the paycheck. A shadow fell over them, long and imposing. Elena looked up, her own smile freezing on her face. A man stood in the doorway, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the air from the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. He was older than she remembered from the faded photographs Isabella used to cherish. His features sharper, harder. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by an aura of raw power and a palpable danger that clung to him like an expensive cologne. Recognition hit her not like a gentle wave of memory, but like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left her breathless. Damian Moretti. This was the man who had shattered her sister, the man whose name was a curse in her family. He was her new boss. His gaze swept the room and landed on her, but there was no flicker of recognition in his dark, piercing eyes. He gave her a brief, dismissive nod, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture, his attention already focused solely on his daughter. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. He crossed the room and scooped Serafina into his arms. His interaction with her was gentle, his large hands careful as he smoothed her hair. But it was also brief, almost perfunctory. He murmured something to her in Italian, kissed her forehead, and then handed her off to Mrs. Petrova, who had materialized in the doorway. Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the echoing hall. Elena remained frozen on the floor, the sketchpad heavy in her lap. A violent storm of emotions raged inside her, a nauseating cocktail of pure, unadulterated fury and a cold, sharp spear of fear. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. She couldn't quit. The money was too vital, the lifeline her family desperately needed. Her mind raced, replaying the endless nights she had held Isabella, listening to her heartbroken sobs, seeing the vacant, haunted look in her eyes that had lingered for months. How could that man, the monster from her sister's stories, have a child he seemed to care for, even in his own distant way? A bitter resolve hardened in her chest. She would do it. She would stay. She would be a ghost in his house. She would pour every ounce of warmth and care she possessed into this lonely little girl. She would take the money that felt like blood money, and then, when it was over, she would disappear from their world without a trace. Over the next few weeks, Elena's vow to be a ghost dissolved in the face of a little girl's profound loneliness. She made it her mission to wage a quiet, colorful war against the sterile silence of the mansion. The playroom, once a monument to minimalist design, was the first territory she claimed. She spent her evenings crafting vibrant paper flowers and whimsical animals, taping them to the stark white walls. She bought a cheap, fluffy rug in a brilliant shade of yellow and, with Mrs. Petrova's grudging permission, replaced the pristine white one. They built sprawling forts from blankets and chairs, held elaborate tea parties in the manicured garden with a mismatched set of cups Elena had found in a forgotten cupboard, and filled the silent afternoons with the rustle of turning pages. Elena read classic children's stories, her voice a chameleon that shifted from the booming growl of a giant to the timid squeak of a mouse. Her expressiveness a stark contrast to the home's muted atmosphere. The first time she coaxed a real, bubbling laugh from Serafina, the sound was so unexpected and precious, like the chiming of tiny forgotten bells, that Elena felt a surge of triumph more profound than any paycheck. From the cold, blue glow of the security monitors in his office, Damian watched the transformation. He saw Elena, her dark hair falling into her eyes, lie on her stomach on the yellow rug, teaching his daughter how to make shadow puppets against the wall. He came home not to a silent house, but to the faint, melodic sound of his daughter's giggles drifting down the grand staircase. He saw the genuine warmth in Elena's every gesture, the infinite patience in her eyes as she knelt beside Serafina, helping her plant a small flower in the garden. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, in loyalty and betrayal, and he couldn't categorize the woman on his screen. She was a variable he hadn't accounted for. One afternoon, he found a piece of paper lying on the polished surface of his massive desk. It was a detailed drawing of a fantastical castle, complete with turrets, a drawbridge, and a friendly-looking dragon peeking over the ramparts. The lines were a child's, unsteady but full of imagination, yet the shading and perspective were clearly guided by a more experienced, artistic hand. It was the first piece of art Serafina had ever willingly shared with him. He stood there for a long time, his fingers tracing the outline of the dragon, a complex and unfamiliar conflict churning within him. He was grateful, deeply so, for the light she had brought back into his daughter's eyes, but he was also suspicious. No one was that selfless. This woman, who had so easily breached the formidable defenses around his child's heart, what did she really want? The interactions between Elena and Damian became a delicate, dangerous dance. They were brief, formal, and charged with the unspoken history that lay between them like a minefield. He began to join them for dinner, his presence at the head of the long, empty dining table both commanding and unsettling. He would ask about Serafina's day, his questions polite and professional, but his gaze was not. It was intense, analytical, and it lingered on Elena a moment too long, making her feel as though he were trying to peel back her skin to see the secrets hidden beneath. She felt pinned by it, a butterfly on a board, and her resolve to remain invisible faltered with every beat of her heart. She kept her answers short, her voice even, her eyes fixed on a point just over his shoulder, refusing to meet that penetrating stare. Every encounter left her hands trembling, her nerves shot. One evening, she was carrying a tray of Serafina's finished dinner plates to the kitchen when he passed her in the hall. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, and the scent of his cologne, something expensive and masculine like sandalwood and bergamot, enveloped her completely. The proximity was unnerving, a jolt to her system, and for a terrifying, inexplicable moment, she felt a strange, unwanted pull toward him, a magnetic force she had to physically resist. He paused, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate in the narrow space between them. She seems happier. Elena's gaze remained fixed on the ornate wallpaper. She's a wonderful child. She hasn't been, not for a long time, he continued, and she could feel his eyes on her, studying her profile. You're good for her. The compliment felt less like a kindness and more like a brand. It marked her, claimed her success as his own. She simply nodded, her throat tight, and hurried past him, her heart hammering against her ribs. A war was raging inside her, The man she saw patiently explaining something to his daughter. The man whose eyes held a deep, weary sadness when he thought no one was looking, was impossible to reconcile with the heartless monster from Isabella's stories. She felt a sickening wave of guilt for the flicker of attraction she'd felt in the hallway, a profound and immediate betrayal of her sister's pain. She was here to do a job, to save her family, not to develop complicated feelings for the man who had almost destroyed it. The library was Elena's sanctuary, a magnificent two-story room with floor-to-ceiling shelves. It was filled with the comforting sacred scent of old leather and paper. It was the one place in the house that felt truly alive to her, a repository of stories and histories that dwarfed the sterile drama of her current life. She was searching for a specific book of fairy tales for Serafina, one she remembered from her own childhood. She'd brought a small canvas bag with a few of her own books from home, hoping to find a quiet moment to read. As she pulled out a worn copy of The Secret Garden, a small, glossy photograph that had been tucked inside as a bookmark fluttered out, landing face up on the dark, polished wood of the floor. It was the picture, the one of her and Isabella from a few years ago, taken on a sunny afternoon at a street fair. They were laughing, their heads close together, their arms slung around each other in an easy, familiar embrace. It was a snapshot of a happier time, a time before Damian Moretti. A cold dread washed over her. She bent to snatch it up, her fingers just inches away when a pair of expensive, hand-stitched leather shoes entered her line of sight. She froze. Looking for something? Damian's voice was deceptively casual. He had entered the library as silently as a predator. Before she could answer, before she could move, his eyes were drawn to the small, colorful square on the floor. He stopped. The silence in the vast room became absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of Elena's own heart. He bent down, his movements fluid and graceful, and picked up the photograph. He looked at the smiling woman in the picture, at Isabella's bright, hopeful face. Then he slowly lifted his gaze to Elena's, who was now standing, her own face pale and terrified. She watched the pieces click into place behind his dark, intelligent eyes. She saw the moment the connection was made, the instant he linked her face, her features so similar to her sister's, with the last name on her employment file, Cruz. He remembered, he looked from the photo to her, and then back again, and the recognition that dawned in his expression was not warm or nostalgic. It was cold, hard, and utterly chilling. His knuckles were white where he gripped the small, insignificant photograph, the fragile paper now feeling like the trigger for a bomb. This was the full, terrifying reality of the moment that had been replaying in her nightmares. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked out of the library, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Elena's legs felt weak, but some primal instinct screamed at her to run. She followed him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her path leading her inevitably to the kitchen where her carefully constructed world had first shattered. He was waiting for her, a large, intimidating silhouette against the cold stainless steel of the refrigerator. He was radiating a controlled fury that was far more terrifying than any overt rage. As she hesitated in the doorway, he moved, cornering her, his large frame blocking her only exit. He held up the photograph, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that cut her to the bone. "I should fire you," he said, the words dripping with ice. He let the photo fall to the counter. "Tell me, Elena, how long were you planning on keeping this a secret?" The glass from her dropped cup was long gone, swept away by the efficient Mrs. Petrova, but the memory of its shattering echoed in the tense silence. Elena trembled, her back pressed against the cold, unyielding wall, but as she looked at his hard, accusing face, something inside her snapped. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with a white-hot surge of defiance. She would not cower. She had done nothing wrong but try to survive. "I recognized you the first day I saw you," she admitted, her voice shaking but clear. She lifted her chin, meeting his furious gaze head-on. "I needed the job. My sister, she has medical bills, expenses from before. I saw the salary, and I didn't care who the client was. I assumed you wouldn't remember me. Why would you? We were nothing to you." She took a ragged breath, her own anger fueling her courage. but my identity has absolutely no bearing on my work here. I have done nothing but care for your daughter. You said it yourself, she's happier. That has nothing to do with who my sister is, and everything to do with the fact that I am good at my job." He listened, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone, but a muscle jumped in his tight jaw. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to shrink away. "The only reason you are not out on the street right now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is because Serafina is finally happy. Because she laughs. For that reason, and that reason alone, you will stay." He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes boring into her. "But the rules have changed. Your little charade is over." Elena's breath hitched. "You think you know what happened with your sister?" He scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "You have no idea what you're talking about. From now on, you are an open book to me. Every conversation, every move, every thought, I will be watching. You are no longer just an employee in this house, Elena. You are my prisoner. Understood?" He wasn't just her employer anymore. He was her warden, and the gilded cage had just become a very real prison. The atmosphere in the mansion became a high-voltage wire, humming with a tension so thick Elena could taste it on her tongue. Damian was true to his word. He was a constant, unnerving presence, a shadow she couldn't shake. He no longer sequestered himself in his office. Instead, he would work from home in the main living area, his laptop open on the coffee table, his dark eyes occasionally lifting to watch her and Serafina build a lopsided tower of blocks on the floor. He joined them for every meal, the vast dining table shrinking under the intensity of his focus. The pretense of him being merely an employer was gone, replaced by the stark reality of him being her warden. His questions, once professionally distant, became personal, probing. He asked about her childhood, about the small town she grew up in. He asked about her studies in book restoration, his interest seeming surprisingly genuine as she described the delicate process of mending torn pages and reinforcing brittle spines. He asked about her dreams, a question so direct and unexpected it stole the air from her lungs. It felt less like an interrogation and more like he was meticulously mapping her, trying to understand the intricate details of the woman he held captive in his gilded cage. Elena remained guarded, her answers brief, her posture stiff. But the constant proximity was a form of erosion, slowly wearing down the walls she had so carefully constructed. She found herself watching him too, collecting small, contradictory moments that she would analyze in the silence of her room at night. She saw the way his large, powerful hands she knew could be ruthless, were surprisingly gentle as he helped Serafina with a frustratingly small puzzle piece. She saw the profound exhaustion and loneliness that settled in his eyes late at night when he sat in the dim light of the library, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, thinking no one was looking. Her mind was a battlefield. This version of Damian, the attentive father, the lonely man burdened by unseen weights, was waging war against the heartless monster she had cultivated in her mind for years. A grudging empathy began to take root in her heart, a treacherous weed that she tried to rip out every time it sprouted. This feeling infuriated her. It frightened her, because it felt like a betrayal not only of Isabella, but of her own righteous anger, the anger that had been a shield for so long. She was losing the clarity of her hatred, and she didn't know what would be left in its place. The danger of his world, once an abstract concept, became terrifyingly real one moonless night. Elena was jolted from a restless sleep by the sound of raised, urgent voices from the garden below her window. She crept out of bed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and peered through a gap in the heavy curtains. The manicured lawns were sliced apart by the sweeping, powerful beams of flashlights. She saw Damian, a dark silhouette amidst the chaos, his voice a low, sharp command that cut through the night air. He was in a heated discussion with his head of security, a formidable man named Luca, while other guards moved with disciplined speed along the perimeter wall. A security alarm had been tripped. The thought sent a jolt of pure, cold fear through her. After a few tense minutes, the activity subsided. The beams of the flashlights lowered, and the guards began to disperse, their movements still coiled with tension. It had been a false alarm, a deer or some other animal, but the reaction was anything but routine. The air was still thick with the metallic taste of adrenaline. As Elena watched, Damian looked up, his gaze unerringly finding her window, seeing her silhouette against the soft light of her room. Her breath caught. Moments later, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find him standing there, still dressed in the dark trousers and shirt he'd been wearing outside. He didn't apologize for the disturbance. There was no room for such pleasantries in his world. He simply explained, his voice a low, rumbling murmur. Tests on my security are common. Rivals like to see if they can find a weakness. He gestured toward the window she had just vacated. It's best to stay away from the windows when there's a disturbance. As he spoke, he reached out, his fingers brushing against the bare skin of her arm, a brief, almost imperceptible touch intended to guide her back from the glass. The contact was electric. A shockwave of heat shot up her arm, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had been gripping her just moments before. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a command, it was a protective gesture, an instinctual move to shield her from a danger she couldn't even see. The warmth of his fingers on her skin lingered long after he had dropped his hand and retreated, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence of her room. He had left her with a quiet, parting command. Go back to bed. You and Serafina are safe. I'll always make sure of that. Her weekly call with Isabella became a tightrope walk over a canyon of secrets. Her sister's voice was noticeably stronger now, the listless, fragile tone replaced by a spark of her old energy. With that returning strength came a renewed curiosity. So, tell me about this job, Lena, Isabella pressed, her voice bright with interest. This rich family, they're treating you well, right? The guy isn't some creep? Elena's hand tightened on the phone. She sat on the edge of her bed, her door slightly ajar to let in the hallway light. It's fine, Izzy. Really. The little girl is sweet. The house is big. She was evasive, her answers vague, her heart pounding with the fear of saying the wrong thing, of letting his name slip past her lips. Don't worry about me. I'm safe. You sound weird, Isabella noted, her perception as sharp as ever. Is there something you're not telling me? No, of course not, Elena lied, forcing a lightness into her tone. I just can't talk about it, Izzy. You know, the NDA. It's super strict. She steered the conversation away, asking about Isabella's doctor's appointments, about a new book she was reading. As she spoke, she heard the faint creak of a floorboard in the hall. She glanced up, but saw nothing. She lowered her voice anyway. Listen, I have to go. I'll call you next week. Okay, Isabella said, a hint of suspicion in her voice. Just be careful. Always, Elena promised, adding softly, and no, it has nothing to do with the past. She ended the call, her entire body trembling with relief. She had no idea that Damian had been walking past her partially open door, that he had stopped, concealed by the shadows of the hallway, when he heard the hushed, secretive tone of her conversation. He didn't hear the context. He didn't hear Isabella's questions. He only heard Elena's evasiveness. He heard her say, I can't talk about it, Izzy, and the final, damning phrase, no, it has nothing to do with the past. He misinterpreted it completely, catastrophically. In his world of plots and betrayals, there was only one way to read her words. He assumed they were plotting. He imagined Elena, his daughter's sweet, patient nanny, feeding information to her sister, the woman who had once been used to try and destroy him. Was it for revenge? For money? His nascent trust? The fragile green shoot that had begun to grow in the barren landscape of his suspicion, withered and died in an instant. It was replaced by a familiar, cold certainty. He felt a surge of white-hot anger, a feeling of profound betrayal that was sharper and more painful than he could have anticipated. He had started to believe she was different. He had started to hope. Now, he saw her as just another schemer, another beautiful face with a hidden agenda, using his own daughter as a pawn to get to him. The next day, the warmth that had begun to tentatively bloom between them was gone, replaced by an Arctic chill. He summoned her to his office with a curt message delivered by Mrs. Petrova. When Elena entered, she found him standing by the window, staring out at the grounds, his back to her. The room smelled of old leather, and the faint, sharp scent of whiskey from a glass sitting on his desk. When he turned, his face was a cold, remote mask. The dangerous, untouchable Mafia boss was back in full force. "What's your game, Elena?" he asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. Elena stared at him, completely bewildered. "I'm talking about the phone call with your sister," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What secrets are you selling? Are you writing a tell-all, feeding information to the tabloids? Or is it something worse? Is Isabella still in contact with her old friends?" The accusation was so far from the truth, so utterly baseless, that Elena could only stare at him in stunned silence for a moment. Then, the shock gave way to a furious, burning anger. You think I would do that?" she stammered, her voice trembling with rage. "You think I would use your daughter, that I would put her at risk, for money? You know nothing about me. You know nothing about loyalty. The injustice of it, after everything she had done to protect his secrets, to protect his child, was a slap in the face." In the heat of her fury, all her carefully constructed walls came crashing down. "You think everyone is a liar and a schemer because that's the world you live in!" She threw his words back at him, her voice rising with every word. "It's the world that lets you destroy people, that let you destroy my sister and walk away without a single scratch, without a moment's regret." The argument escalated, their voices sharp and angry in the quiet, opulent office. Finally, his control snapped, his face a mask of raw frustration and something else, something painful that she couldn't name. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and grabbed her by the arms. "You know nothing about what happened with Isabella," he snarled, his grip firm, his face inches from hers. The sudden physical contact, the raw force of his anger, silenced them both. The room was suddenly charged with a different kind of energy, something volatile and unpredictable. They were standing inches apart, chests heaving, the echoes of their shouts hanging in the air between them. The line between his fury and her own, between anger and a terrifying unwanted passion, blurred into non-existence. She could feel the heat of his body, the thrum of his pulse through his hands on her arms. His grip was strong, but it wasn't painful. It was anchoring. She looked into his eyes and saw the carefully controlled facade crack, revealing a raw, wounded emotion that mirrored the turmoil in her own heart. And in that moment, Elena was terrifyingly aware of her own body's response, a traitorous hum of awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the man holding her captive. The charged silence in the office was a living thing, thick and heavy with unspoken words and the raw energy of their confrontation. Damian's grip on her arms wasn't painful, but it was unbreakable, a physical anchor in the emotional storm. His eyes, which had been blazing with fury moments before, now held a universe of frustration and a deep, aching pain that stunned her into stillness. He slowly, reluctantly, let her go, but his gaze held her captive. He took a step back, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of pure exhaustion. "Stay," he commanded, his voice no longer sharp with anger, but rough with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. "Sit down, Elena. You want to talk about the past? You want to talk about your sister? Then you're going to listen to the truth." Her world, which had already felt tilted on its axis, began to spin. She sank into one of the plush leather chairs opposite his desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. He didn't sit, but paced before the large window, a caged tiger in his own domain. "Isabella wasn't some innocent victim I grew tired of," he began, his voice low and strained. "She was involved with someone else, a man named Marco Verratti." He said the name as if it were a curse, a poison on his tongue. "He's my rival, not in business, not in any way you would understand. He's a vulture, a snake, and he was using her." Elena stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. Isabella, involved with another man? It was impossible. Her sister had been utterly devoted to Damian, her heartbreak absolute. He was feeding her lies, whispering promises in her ear. Damian continued, his back still to her, and in return, she was giving him information. Small things at first. My schedule, the names of my associates, details about my shipments. She didn't understand what she was doing. She thought it was a game, that she was helping a man who cared for her get a leg up on his competitor. He finally turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was devastating. It was a mixture of self-loathing and profound sorrow. When I found out, I was faced with a choice. I could expose her. I could let the world, my world, know she was a traitor. And Moretti, once his tool was discovered, would have silenced her permanently. Or, he paused, his throat working. I could break her heart. I could push her away so completely, so cruelly, that Moretti would see her as useless, discarded trash, and lose all interest. I had to make her hate me, so he would let her live. The story was horrifying, a monstrous, twisted version of the past she thought she knew. But with a terrible, logical clarity, the pieces began to fit. Isabella's vague explanations, her deep, unshakable shame that had always seemed disproportionate to just a breakup. I staged a public, humiliating breakup, Damian confessed, his voice barely a whisper. I said things to her I'll regret for the rest of my life. I painted myself as the villain to save her life. And ever since, I have been paying her medical bills, every single one, through an anonymous foundation I set up for that exact purpose. He finally looked at her, his gaze raw and vulnerable. I could have buried her for what she did. Instead, I buried my own reputation. I let your sister and the world think I was a monster because it was the only way to keep her alive. A few days later, the world felt like a different color. The mansion was no longer a prison but a strange, gilded sanctuary. Damian, in a gesture of trust that felt monumental, had arranged for her to meet Isabella. He didn't just allow it, he insisted on it, telling her that the truth needed to heal them both. He had Luca, his silent, watchful head of security, drive her to a small, bustling coffee shop in a neutral part of the city. The public setting felt surreal, a bizarrely normal backdrop for the conversation she was about to have. Isabella was already there, sitting at a small table by the window. She looked better than Elena had seen her in years. The listless fragility was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. She jumped up when she saw Elena, her eyes wide with questions. Elena didn't waste time. She sat down, took her sister's hands in her own, and, as gently but as firmly as she could, she told her everything. She told her about Damian, about the job, about the conversation in his office. She didn't accuse, she simply laid out the facts as he had presented them. At the mention of Marco Moretti's name, Isabella flinched as if struck. Her face crumpled, and the strength Elena had seen just moments before dissolved into a wave of deep, shuddering sobs. The confession, when it came, was a torrent of shame and regret, whispered between tears. She had been young, she explained, so naive. She had met Marco at a gallery opening, and he had swept her off her feet with his charm and lavish attention. He had painted Damian as a ruthless competitor who was unfairly cornering the market, and she, blinded by infatuation, had believed him. She had passed along information, thinking she was helping the man she was falling for, never understanding the deadly seriousness of the world she had stumbled into. He dropped me the second Damian ended things, Isabella whispered, her face streaked with tears and mascara. He just disappeared. I knew then. I knew Damian had done it to protect me. I was so ashamed, Lena. I let you hate him. I let everyone hate him. Because it was easier than admitting how stupid I had been, how much danger I had put myself in. The conversation was painful, a lancing of a wound that had been festering for years, but it was also cleansing. As they sat there, their hands clasped across the table amidst the oblivious chatter of strangers and the comforting smell of coffee and cinnamon, their sisterly bond, once strained by secrets, was reaffirmed, now forged in the hard, bright fire of truth. Elena left the coffee shop with a profound, aching new understanding of the sacrifices Damian had made and the weight of the crown he wore. On the drive back, Elena asked Luca to stop at a small second-hand bookstore she had always loved. She needed a moment to breathe, to surround herself with the quiet, comforting presence of old books before returning to the charged atmosphere of the mansion. She spent half an hour wandering the narrow, dusty aisles, her fingers trailing over worn spines, the scent of aging paper a balm to her frayed soul. When she stepped back out onto the sunny street, a book tucked under her arm, the feeling hit her. It was a cold prickle on the back of her neck, the primal, instinctual sense of being watched. She scanned the street. Everything looked normal, people walking their dogs, cars driving past. She shook it off as paranoia, a side effect of the week's revelations. But as she got into the black town car Luca was waiting in, she saw it. A dark sedan, parked across the street, with two men inside. They weren't talking. They were just sitting there, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed directly on her. As Luca pulled away from the curb, the sedan pulled out behind them. It followed them for 3 blocks, maintaining a steady distance, before turning off abruptly. It wasn't a chase, it was a message. A message for Damian. Marco Verratti was watching. He had noticed her. He might not know she was Isabella's sister, but he saw a new woman in Damian's orbit, a woman who was allowed a certain freedom, and he was identifying a potential point of leverage. The theoretical danger of Damian's world was suddenly terrifyingly real. The fear was a cold, sharp blade twisting in her gut. This wasn't just about a painful past anymore, it was about a lethal present. A present she had now stumbled directly into the center of. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the burner phone Luca had given her for emergencies. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs as she told him what had happened. She understood now. She was no longer just an observer. She was a piece on the board. When Damian learned of the incident, his fury was a cold, controlled inferno. The relaxed atmosphere of the last few days vanished, replaced by a suffocating blanket of security. Guards, once discreetly positioned, were now a visible, constant presence at every corner of the estate. Elena was forbidden from leaving the grounds for any reason. The mansion, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, once again became her prison, albeit a beautiful and luxurious one. This forced proximity, however, did what weeks of tension and conversation could not. It erased the last of their professional boundaries, the last pretense that she was merely an employee and he her boss. They were now 2 people trapped in a fortress together, bound by a shared threat. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Elena's mind was a whirlwind of fear and a strange, burgeoning excitement. She found herself in the vast, silent kitchen, the same room where her deception had shattered, seeking a glass of water. A moment later, he was there, as if he had been drawn by the same restless energy. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a simple gray t-shirt and dark sweatpants, making him look younger, more approachable, yet no less formidable. They didn't talk about the threat. They didn't talk about Verratti or the men in the car. Instead, in the dim, intimate glow of the under-cabinet lighting, they talked about things that mattered in a different way. He asked about the book she'd bought, and she found herself telling him about her passion for first editions, for the history a single book could hold. She talked about her childhood, about learning the craft of restoration from her grandfather in his dusty workshop. He listened, truly listened, and in return, he shared pieces of himself. He told her about his own childhood in this very house, a lonely boy in a world of adults, finding solace in the sprawling library. It was a quiet, unguarded conversation that stretched for hours, a fragile bridge being built between 2 impossibly different worlds. The attraction that had been simmering between them for weeks, a dangerous undercurrent beneath layers of anger and suspicion, was now a palpable force in the small space. It was in the way their eyes met and held for a beat too long, in the way they were so careful not to let their hands brush as they reached for the same water pitcher. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, and they both knew it. Finally, as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, Elena voiced the thought that had been circling in her mind. "I feel like a prisoner," she whispered, the words hanging in the air between them. He didn't deny it. He looked at her, his dark eyes full of a complex mix of regret and unyielding resolve. "I know," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, "and I hate it. But I'd rather you hate me for keeping you locked in here than have Verratti get his hands on you. That is not a possibility I am willing to entertain." A few days of suffocating quiet passed. The forced proximity had woven a new kind of tension between them, a fragile, dangerous intimacy that hummed in the air whenever they were in the same room. Then, Verratti sent his next message. It wasn't subtle. Luca discovered it in the morning. A single, perfect black rose lying on the windshield of Damian's armored sedan. The car had been parked deep within the garage, behind layers of security. It was a violation of the sanctuary, a chilling statement that Varati's reach was longer than they had imagined. The dead flower was a promise of what he could do to something, or someone, living. Damian's control, already stretched thin, began to fray. He spent the day in his office, a storm of contained fury, his voice on the phone a low, lethal instrument, giving orders. That night, Elena sought refuge in the library, the one place that felt like a haven. She was curled in a large leather armchair, a book open in her lap, though she hadn't read a single word. She was pale, her eyes wide with a fear she could no longer hide. The walls of the mansion, which had once felt so vast, now seemed to be closing in, suffocating her. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt the shift in the atmosphere. She looked up to see him standing there, his expression stripped bare, raw with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a volatile mix of terror, rage, and a desperate, aching tenderness. He walked toward her, not with his usual commanding stride, but with the unsteady gait of a man pushed to his absolute limit. "I can't do this," he whispered, his voice rough. He stopped in front of her chair, forcing her to look up at him. "Having you here, in this house, it's a constant torment. Every shadow I see, I think it's for you. Every sound in the night, I think they've found a way in." He ran a hand through his hair, his composure shattering. "But the thought of sending you away, of not knowing where you are, if you're safe, that's worse. It's so much worse." He knelt before her, bringing them eye to eye. The last of his defenses crumbled. "I haven't been able to think of anyone else since that day in this library, since I saw that photograph and realized who you were. I tried to hate you. I tried to see you as a threat, as your sister's keeper, but all I see is you." He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking the soft skin of her cheeks with a reverence that made her tremble. The rough texture of his calloused skin against hers was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "Elena." He breathed her name like a prayer, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss born of desperation, of fear, of weeks of unspoken tension and forbidden longing. It was fierce, passionate, and consuming, a drowning man's gasp for air. It was the taste of expensive whiskey and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. The world narrowed to this single, cataclysmic moment, the scent of old books and his cologne filling her senses, the solid feel of his hands holding her as if he would never let go. Every warning bell in her head was screaming, but she ignored them. With a small, broken sound in the back of her throat, Elena's hands came up to tangle in his hair, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up fear, confusion, and a terrifying, undeniable desire of her own. The morning after was a masterpiece of awkwardness. The kiss, a cataclysm that had shattered the world the night before, now hung in the air between them, a silent, shimmering entity of its own. They sat at the small breakfast nook, the bright morning sun streaming in, with Serafina happily chattering between them, a small, innocent buffer in a war zone of unspoken feelings. Elena focused on cutting Serafina's pancakes into tiny, perfect squares, her hands not quite steady. Damian stared into his coffee cup as if it held the secrets to the universe. They couldn't stop looking at each other. Quick, stolen glances that felt as loud as shouts in the quiet room. When Elena reached for the syrup at the same time as him, their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, a jolt of lightning that made her snatch her hand back as if burned. A faint blush crept up her neck, and she saw a muscle jump in his jaw. Serafina, oblivious, simply pointed a sticky finger and said, "More, please." After Serafina was happily occupied with a new coloring book at the table, Damian cleared his throat. "Elena," he began, his voice low and serious. "About last night, panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She wasn't ready. She couldn't begin to process what the kiss meant, what her response to it meant. She jumped to her feet, grabbing her empty plate. I should, get this to the kitchen, and I promised Serafina we would finish the puzzle in the playroom." She fled the room without another look, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind was a battlefield. One part of her was soaring, her lips still tingling with the memory of his, her body replaying the feel of his hands on her skin. It was a feeling so powerful, so intoxicating, it left her breathless. But another part of her, the logical, sensible part, was screaming in terror. She was falling in love with a mafia boss, a man whose life was steeped in violence and danger, a man whose world could swallow her whole and leave nothing behind. She felt like she was losing herself, the clear lines of who she was blurring and dissolving in the heat of his gaze. She had walked into this house with a clear purpose, a righteous anger. Now, she was adrift in a sea of complicated, terrifying emotions, and she didn't know which way was sure. After a week of being confined to the house and its grounds, Serafina's bright energy began to dim. The laughter came less frequently, and she would spend long stretches of the afternoon staring listlessly out the window. It broke Elena's heart. That evening, she found Damian in his study and, gathering all her courage, she begged him, "Please, Damian, she needs to get out, just for an hour. She's wilting in here." She suggested the private botanical garden, a sprawling, beautiful estate owned by his family for generations, a place she knew could be secured. He was hesitant, the lines around his eyes tight with worry. The memory of the black rose was still fresh. But as he looked at Elena's pleading face and thought of his daughter's sad eyes, he relented. "1 hour," he said, his voice firm. "Luca will lead the detail himself. You do not leave his sight for a second. Understood?" Moretti, it turned out, was a patient predator. He had been anticipating a move like this, a moment when Damian's personal feelings might create a small crack in his fortress. His men had been watching the botanical garden for days. The garden was beautiful, a paradise of lush greenery, vibrant flowers, and winding stone paths. For 45 minutes, it was perfect. Serafina's laughter echoed through the trees as she chased a vibrant blue butterfly, her cheeks flushed with happiness. Elena felt the tension in her own shoulders begin to ease. Then, from the far end of the park, near the main entrance, came a commotion, shouting, and the screech of tires. It was a diversion, expertly planned. As Luca barked orders into his radio, sending 2 of his men to investigate, 2 other men materialized from the dense foliage near the secluded koi pond where Elena and Serafina were standing. They moved quickly, their faces hard and emotionless. Elena's blood ran cold. There was no time to think, only to react. Her instincts, primal and fierce, took over. She shoved a startled Serafina behind her, shielding the small girl with her own body. Her eyes darted around, landing on a heavy fallen branch from an old oak tree. She grabbed it, the rough bark digging into her palms. It was clumsy and heavy, but it was something. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice high with terror but laced with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She swung the branch wildly as the men advanced. "Luca, help!" Her bravery was a desperate, beautiful, and ultimately futile gesture. One of the men simply slapped the branch aside, the force of it sending a painful shock up her arm, but it had bought them precious seconds. Suddenly, Luca and his remaining guard were there, converging on the spot with silent, brutal efficiency. A brief, violent scuffle erupted. The peaceful garden transformed into a place of grunts, the sickening thud of fists, and the smell of churned dirt and raw fear. One of Verotti's men pulled a gun, and Luca's man responded in kind. 2 gunshots cracked through the air, deafeningly loud, but they were warning shots, fired into the soft earth, a violent negotiation in a language Elena didn't understand. Moments later, it was over. Verotti's men were subdued, and the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. But the terror remained, a cold poison in the air. And then, another sound, the roar of a powerful engine and the screech of tires as Damian's car skidded to a halt on the gravel path. He burst out of the car, his face a mask of pure, murderous fury. His eyes, wild and frantic, scanned the scene, and then they found her. He saw Elena, her hair wild, her clothes stained with dirt, her face pale with shock, clutching his crying, terrified daughter to her chest. And in that instant, something inside him, some carefully constructed wall of control, broke completely. He ignored Luca's report. He ignored the captured men being held at gunpoint. He walked straight to them, his world narrowing to the 2 people who mattered more than his own life. He knelt, his hands gentle and shaking as he checked them both over, his eyes searching for any injury. "Are you hurt? Elena, are you hurt?" She could only shake her head, her throat too tight to speak. He pulled them both into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair, his other hand protectively cradling the back of Serafina's head. He held them as if he could physically absorb their fear, as if he could weld them to him and never let them go. In the armored car speeding back to the mansion, the world outside a blur of motion, Serafina's sobs had subsided. She was curled up on Luca's lap in the front passenger seat, distracted by a cartoon on his phone, the trauma already beginning to recede as it does for children. In the back, Damian didn't let go of Elena's hand. He held it tightly, his thumb stroking over her knuckles, his touch grounding her. He turned to her, his eyes dark and blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. The time for games, for secrets, for holding back, was over. Moretti had crossed a line from which there was no return. "This ends now," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it was almost a physical force. "He came after you. He came after my daughter. There are no more rules." He reached out with his free hand, cupping her jaw, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Elena, look at me." She did, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart stop. It was love, fierce, unconditional, and absolute. "I love you," he confessed, the words a raw, undeniable truth. "You are not the babysitter. You are not my ex-girlfriend's sister. You are mine. You and Serafina, you are my family, and I will burn this city to the ground to keep you safe." Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was one of impending war. After settling a still-shaken Serafina into bed, Damian led Elena to his study. He poured her a whiskey she didn't touch before turning to his work. His voice on the phone was a low, lethal instrument of rapid Italian, giving orders that made her shiver with a fear that was not for herself, but for him. When he finished, he faced her, his expression a mask of grim determination. "He threatened my family," Damian said, his voice flat. "There is only one way this ends." He walked to a cabinet and began strapping on a lightweight tactical vest over his dark shirt, his movements economical and practiced. "I have to go out. I have to end this threat. Permanently. I need one thing from you." He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "I need you to trust me. Stay here, keep Serafina safe, and do not leave this house, no matter what you hear. Luca's best men will be outside your door." Tears welled in her eyes. She set the untouched whiskey down and stepped toward him, her hands coming up to rest on the hard material of his vest. "Just come back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Promise me you'll come back to us." For a moment, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing the man who had confessed his love to her. His eyes softened, and he cupped her cheek. "I have more to come back for than I have ever had in my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." He leaned down and kissed her, not with the desperation of before, but with a profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss that was both a promise and a goodbye, a vow sealed in a world where vows were paid for in blood. He lingered for a moment, his forehead resting against hers, then touched her face one last time, his eyes full of love and a terrible resolve. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the utter silence. The night was the longest of Elena's life. She sat vigil by Serafina's bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her small chest, but sleep was an impossible dream. Every creak of the old house sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her system. The mansion's silence was unnerving, a held breath before a storm. Eventually, she slipped out and padded silently down the grand staircase to the main living area, cast in deep shadows. She walked to the massive windows and stared out into the impenetrable darkness, looking for headlights, for any sign of his return. "He will not thank you for catching a chill." The calm, accented voice came from behind her. Elena spun around to find Mrs. Petrova standing there, holding 2 steaming mugs. The stern housekeeper's face was softened with something that looked like concern. "I couldn't sleep," Elena admitted. "None of us can on a night like this, Mrs. Petrova said simply, handing her a mug of chamomile tea. "Come, sit." They sat together on a large sofa in a companionable silence, a quiet gesture of solidarity more comforting than words. "I remember when he was just a boy," Mrs. Petrova said suddenly, her gaze distant. "After his mother passed, his father became hard. This house was a lonely place. Damian would hide in the library, always trying to protect something. He builds walls, Miss Cruz, high, strong walls. But he builds them to protect what is inside, not to keep the world out. She turned her gaze to Elena, her eyes clear and knowing. He has more to lose now than ever before. That will make him more careful. It will bring him home. The housekeeper's words settled over Elena, a balm to her raw nerves. In that quiet moment of shared vulnerability, Elena felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer an outsider. This house, this child, this complicated, dangerous man, they were her home now. She looked out into the darkness, and the fear was still there, but beneath it, a fierce, unwavering love had taken root. She accepted it completely, and with it, everything that came with his world. The sky was just beginning to bleed from black to a soft, bruised purple when she heard it, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Not one car, but several. Elena's heart leaped into her throat. She ran, her bare feet silent on the cold marble of the entrance hall. The massive front doors swung open before she reached them. And then, he was there. He walked in, silhouetted by the first rays of dawn. He was alive. That was her first, overwhelming thought. He was bruised, a dark contusion on his cheekbone, and a small cut bled sluggishly at his temple. His clothes were disheveled, and he smelled of the cold morning air, of smoke, and faintly of iron. He looked utterly exhausted, but he was standing. He was victorious. Behind him, Luca met her gaze for a fraction of a second and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The threat was over. Damian's eyes found hers across the cavernous hall, and the world fell away. They didn't speak. There were no words for the tidal wave of relief that washed over her, so powerful it made her knees weak. She ran the last few feet, and he met her halfway, his arms wrapping around her and lifting her off her feet, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She buried her face in the curve of his neck, inhaling his scent, the scent of survival, reassuring herself that he was real and solid and here. Silent tears of relief streamed down her face. He held her for a long, timeless moment, the solid feel of him in her arms chasing away the night's ghosts. He finally lowered her until her feet touched the floor but didn't let go. His hands framed her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, and he whispered her name. Just her name. Elena. It was the only word he needed to say. It held everything. The fear of the night, the relief of the morning, the promise of all the days to come. Several months later, the mansion was a home. The oppressive security had relaxed, melting back into an invisible shield. The silence was no longer tense but peaceful, filled with Serafina's laughter and the faint, classical music that drifted from Elena's new studio. Damian had given her one of the large, sunlit rooms overlooking the gardens. It was filled with the tools of her trade, with the familiar, comforting scent of paper and leather, a small kingdom of her own within his larger one. Life had found a new, beautiful, normal. They were in the garden on a perfect late spring afternoon. Serafina, now a happy, carefree 6-year-old, was chasing butterflies across the sprawling lawn, her giggles like wind chimes. Elena stood watching her, a soft smile on her face, a profound peace, so deep it felt like a dream. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and she leaned back into Damian's solid chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and they watched their daughter together. "I have something for you," he murmured against her ear. She turned in his arms to face him. He held out not a velvet box, but a book. It was old, the leather cover worn and soft with age, the title embossed in faded gold leaf. It was a rare, first-edition copy of her favorite classic novel, the very one she had told him about on that long night in the kitchen. It was a gift that spoke not of his wealth, but of his attention. It was a symbol that he saw her, the real her, the woman who loved old books and found beauty in forgotten stories. Tears welled in her eyes as she took the precious volume, her fingers tracing the delicate lettering. "Damian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as the woman holding it," he said softly, his gaze full of a deep, unwavering love. They stood there, talking about their future, about building a life together. They knew danger was still part of their reality, a shadow lingering at the edges of their bright world, but it was no longer the center of it. Love, family, and home, that was their center now. I never knew this kind of peace was possible, Damian said, his voice full of a quiet wonder as he looked from Elena to his laughing daughter. We found it together, Elena replied, her heart full to bursting. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss full of love and the promise of 1,000 more afternoons just like this one. She had walked into his world by accident, a ghost haunted by a painful past, but she was staying by choice, not just as the woman he loved, but as the queen to his dangerous, beautiful kingdom.